Where will I go? How will I live?
In the winter of 2009, an 18-year-old with $50 in his pocket and nowhere left to sleep bought a house. Not a real house. A ruin. A forgotten shell rotting at the end of a dead-end road in rural Pennsylvania. A place the county had written off, the neighbors had stopped looking at, and every sensible person had long since decided was good for nothing. Everyone who saw that cottage told him he'd wasted his last dollar. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Because hidden inside those walls was a secret that had been buried for over 70 years. A secret worth more than anyone imagined, and a secret that someone, a very specific someone, did not want found. By the time this story was over, an 18-year-old kid with nothing to his name would uncover a Depression-era fortune, a family torn apart by greed, a 70-year-old lie that had cheated an entire bloodline out of what was rightfully theirs, and a hidden room that nobody had opened since 1941. Stay with me, because nothing about this story is what it appears to be. 3 questions are going to drive this entire story. First, how does a homeless 18-year-old end up buying a house, even a $50 wreck, and what made him choose this one? Second, what was hidden inside those walls that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal for 7 decades? And third, and this is the one that's going to stay with you, who buried the secret, and why did they never come back for it? There's a young man with nothing left to lose. There's an old family with a dark secret they carried to their graves. There's a lawyer who knew too much and said too little. And there's a fortune, hidden not in a bank, not in a safety deposit box, but inside the walls of the most overlooked building in a forgotten Pennsylvania county. By the time we're done, you'll see how ordinary people, ordinary greed, ordinary fear, can bury the truth for a lifetime. Caleb Morse was born in 1991 in Clarion County, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the old economy died quietly and nobody replaced it. His father worked the mines until the mines didn't need him. His mother cleaned motel rooms. They weren't rich, they weren't even comfortable, but they were together, until they weren't. By the time Caleb was 16, his father was gone, not dead, just gone. One day there, next day not. His mother held on for 2 more years before her health gave out. At 18, Caleb Morse had no family, no address, and $50 to his name, his last pay from a summer roofing job. Caleb had learned one thing from watching the old men in his town. Property means stability. Land means you're somewhere. It means you exist. So instead of spending his last $50 on a motel room that would be gone by morning, he walked into the county assessor's office and asked a question nobody his age ever asked. What's the cheapest piece of property in this county? The clerk didn't laugh. She'd seen desperate people before. She pointed him to a list. Properties so far behind on taxes the county was practically giving them away to clear the books. One entry stopped Caleb cold. Holloway Road. He'd never heard of it. Nobody had. That should have been a warning. When Caleb first laid eyes on 1 Holloway Road, his first thought was, this is a mistake. His second thought was, this is mine. Caleb Morse had grown up watching men build things, fix things, make something from nothing. He saw potential where everyone else saw a teardown. He paid his $47 in back taxes that afternoon, and by nightfall, he was sleeping on the floor of the most dangerous house in Elk Creek Township. He had a home. It was a wreck, but it was his. For the first 3 months, the cottage was barely a shelter. No running water, no heat except for a wood stove Caleb salvaged from a neighbor's scrap pile. He learned plumbing from library books, electrical from YouTube. He bartered labor, roofing for other families in exchange for materials. Slowly, painfully, he was turning a condemned shell into a home. But as he worked deeper into the walls, pulling old lath and plaster, he began finding things. Small things at first. An old tin can behind a wall panel, a child's shoe, worn through at the toe, a rusted belt buckle, each item photographed carefully, almost reverently on his cracked phone. He wasn't a historian, he wasn't a treasure hunter, He was just a kid trying to stay warm. But something about this house felt different to him, like it had a story it was trying to tell. He just needed to be patient enough to listen. 1941, the year after the Depression, the year America was about to go to war, and someone named H. Morrow had hidden a letter inside this wall and prayed, perhaps desperately prayed, that someday someone would find it. I won't read you the letter yet, because to understand what it meant, you need to understand who H. Morrow was, and what happened to this family, and why someone hid not just a letter, but something else behind these walls. The tin box contained coins, not modern coins, old coins, silver dollars dated from the 1930s, mercury dimes, walking Liberty half-dollars. Caleb didn't know what they were worth. He assumed they were decorative, sentimental maybe. He was wrong about that too. The journal was the valuable part. The journal changed everything. The journal belonged to Harold Morrow, born 1890 in Elk Creek Township, carpenter by trade, father of 3, and, as the journal made achingly clear, a man who had spent the last years of his life living in terror of his own brother. Harold Morrow had been hiding something far more significant than coins and a letter, and the man he was hiding it from, his younger brother Edmund, had apparently gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure it was never found, even after Harold died. To understand what Harold hid and why, we have to understand what the Morrows once were. Because they weren't always struggling. 80 years before Caleb stumbled onto this land, the Morrows were one of the most prosperous families in Elk Creek Township. Harold and Edmund's father, Thomas Morrow, had built a small timber empire in the 1890s. By 1910, the Morrow family owned 600 acres of prime Pennsylvania woodland, a sawmill, and several tenant farms. They weren't millionaires, but in rural Pennsylvania in 1910, they were as close to it as you could get. Then came 1929, and the Depression didn't just hurt the Morrows, it nearly destroyed them. By 1934, most of the farmland was gone. The sawmill had closed. What remained was the original family plot, Harold's cottage and the land around it, and whatever cash Thomas Morrow had managed to hold back from the banks. Harold's journal tells a story that, once you read it, you can't unread. According to Harold, in 1936, their father's estate came up for final settlement, delayed for years by the Depression and bad lawyers, and Edmund, who had always been the charming one, the one who knew how to talk to men in suits, Edmund had the papers redrawn. Harold didn't read the fine print. He trusted his brother. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. Harold wrote, "Edmund has taken what was father's intention to divide equally. He has the deed to the north 400 acres, and the mill site. He claims I signed it over. I did not understand what I was signing. I am a carpenter, not a lawyer. My children will have nothing because of my stupidity and my brother's cunning. $2.1 million, sitting in the ground. Signed away from Harold's children with a pen stroke Harold didn't fully understand." But Harold, stubborn, quiet Harold, hadn't given up entirely. Here's where it gets extraordinary. Harold Morrow, who died in 1987 at the age of 97, had spent over 40 years preparing for the possibility that his children or grandchildren might someday reclaim what Edmund took. He was a patient man, and a methodical one. Hidden in the walls of that cottage, in addition to the coins and the journal, were copies of the original estate documents, predating Edmund's alterations, a signed statement from 2 witnesses who had been present at the estate meeting in 1936, and a deed, a separate deed, to 12 acres of land that Edmund had overlooked because it was the least valuable parcel of the property. Land that had sat, untouched, for 70 years. Land that now contained something Edmund could not have foreseen. Natural gas. The fracking boom had come to Pennsylvania, and Harold Morrow's forgotten 12 acres sat directly over a formation that energy companies had been mapping for 2 years. Here's where many young men in Caleb's position might have made a different choice. He had the deed to 12 acres. He could file it in his own name. Easily done. The previous owner had died with no one to contest it. He could let the natural gas lease be written in his name. He could be set for life before his 19th birthday. Caleb Morse did not do that. He started looking for the Morrow family. Harold Morrow had 3 children: Ruth, born 1921, James, born 1924, Dorothy, born 1928. Ruth and James had died in the 1990s. But Dorothy, the youngest, had lived to 81 and had died just 4 years before Caleb moved into that cottage. She had children, and those children had children. 2 hours from Clarion, Dorothy's eldest son, a man named Robert Harker, then 58 years old, was living in a suburb of Pittsburgh, working as an electrician. He had no idea that his grandfather had hidden anything in those walls. He had no idea the property still existed. He'd been told the family land was gone, sold off, lost to taxes, decades ago. Robert Harker was, by his own later description, skeptical, deeply skeptical. He'd heard about people claiming to have found things that belonged to your family before. He almost didn't call back. But something in the letter stopped him. Caleb had mentioned the cameo brooch, the woman's brooch found in the wall. Robert Harker recognized it. His mother, Dorothy, had described it to him her entire childhood. A brooch that had been his grandmother's, that had disappeared when the family left the old property. It was a specific, unprovable detail, unless you'd actually found it. Robert Harker drove to Clarion the following Saturday morning. He arrived at the cottage at 9 a.m. and stood in the doorway for a long time before he came inside. He was 58 years old, a working electrician, a man who'd spent his life being practical. And he was standing in his grandfather's house for the first time. He didn't cry. He was quiet for a very long time. And then he said, very quietly, "My mother told me about this place her whole life. She said Grandpa Harold always promised it would come right in the end. She never believed him, but she never stopped hoping." Here's what no one expected. The legal case, which on paper seemed straightforward, original documents, witness statements, a clear chain of deception, turned out to be anything but. Edmund Morrow had died in 1979. But Edmund's children, Harold's niece and nephew, now elderly, still owned the 400 acres and the mineral rights they'd inherited. And when word got out that someone was challenging the 1936 transfer, their lawyers came out swinging. Statute of limitations, the legal equivalent of, maybe you're right, but you're too late. These documents were 70 years old. The transfer had been unchallenged for 70 years. Courts don't easily unwind 7 decades of legal history. It looked like Edmund's deception might outlast even death. The cottage had a cellar, not unusual for old Pennsylvania farmhouses. What was unusual was what Caleb found when he measured the interior dimensions of the cellar against the exterior footprint of the house. 8 feet doesn't sound like much. Unless those 8 feet are a sealed room that someone bricked up so carefully it looks like foundation wall. More documents, more coins, but also, and this is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming, personal effects that didn't belong to Harold Morrow. A man's watch, a leather wallet, a military identification card, and a sealed metal document tube, the kind used to protect papers from moisture and rats. James, Harold's son, Robert Harker's uncle, killed in action in the Pacific in 1944. His personal effects, supposedly lost, had been returned to Harold, and Harold had sealed them in this room along with something else. Something in that metal tube. Inside that tube was a letter from an attorney, not a local country lawyer, but a Philadelphia attorney, dated 1943. James Morrow, before he shipped out for the Pacific, had consulted this attorney about his father Harold's situation, and the Philadelphia attorney had sent Harold a letter confirming, in detailed legal language, that the 1936 transfer documents contained what appeared to be a forged witness signature. a forged witness signature. Harold had known it for 80 years. He'd had a Philadelphia lawyer's letter confirming it, waiting for someone with the integrity to find it and do something with it. The Philadelphia attorney's letter was not, by itself, enough to overturn 70 years of legal ownership, but it was enough to get a hearing. And that hearing produced something the Edmund branch's lawyers hadn't anticipated: a forensic document examiner who confirmed, using modern analysis techniques, that the 1936 witness signature was indeed inconsistent with the historical record. It took 14 months, 2 court hearings, 1 appeal that was denied. But in the spring of 2011, 2 years after Caleb Morse had slept on the floor of that condemned cottage for the first time, a Pennsylvania circuit court ruled that the 1936 Morrow estate transfer had been obtained through fraud. The original Harold Morrow line was the legitimate heir to the contested 400 acres. Robert Harker and his brother became the owners of 400 acres of Pennsylvania timberland and the mineral rights beneath it. Within 8 months, a natural gas company signed a lease for the north parcel. Within 18 months, the Harker brothers had received the first royalty payment. It was more money than either of them had earned in 5 years of working. The question everyone asks is, what did Caleb Morse get out of all this? He got his cottage, clear title, no debt, restored with his own hands. He got a relationship with the Harker family that, by all accounts, changed his life. Robert Harker hired him, first for odd jobs, then as a full-time contractor, as the family began developing the recovered land. But Caleb also received something he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. Robert Harker quietly arranged a finder's fee, a modest but meaningful sum, paid directly from the first natural gas royalty check. It was enough for Caleb to buy equipment for his own contracting business, enough to stop working for other people and start working for himself. He was 21 years old. He owned a home and a business. 3 years earlier, he'd been counting change outside a convenience store. Edmund Morrow's grandchildren, the ones who lost the lawsuit, were not left destitute. They retained significant other assets, but they lost the north 400 acres and the natural gas rights, and they lost something harder to quantify: the comfortable certainty that what their family had was legitimately theirs. One of Edmund's granddaughters, in a brief statement to the local paper, said simply, "We didn't know." It's possible that's true. It's possible that Edmund's deception was his alone, carried to his grave, passed down as clean inheritance to children who never asked where it came from. That's the thing about buried sins. They don't just affect the people who bury them. This story isn't unusual because of the money. Plenty of people find things in old houses. What's unusual is what Caleb Morse chose to do with what he found. He was 18 years old. He was homeless. He had every reason in the world to look out for himself and nobody else. And he chose, instead, to find the people the secret had been kept from and give it back to them. Harold Morrow died in 1987, never seeing his plan bear fruit. But he had faith enough to seal those documents in a room and wait. Wait for someone honest enough to find them and brave enough to act on what they found. The right person found it, at the right time. That's not always how it works, but this time, it did. Every story we uncover in the hidden vault teaches us something. This one taught us 5 things that Harold Morrow had already figured out and written down in that journal before Caleb Morse was even born. Lesson 1. Patience is a form of power. Harold waited 50 years for justice rather than give up. He didn't get to see it, but his patience made it possible. Patience isn't passive. It's a long game played by people with faith in the outcome. Lesson 2. What appears worthless can be priceless. A $50 condemned cottage contained a fortune in land rights, a legal vindication, and a life-changing opportunity. What we dismiss and write off is sometimes where the greatest value hides. Look twice at what others throw away. Lesson 3. Integrity compounds over time. Caleb Morse could have taken everything for himself. He chose differently. And that choice returned more to him. In relationships, reputation, and opportunity, than any shortcut could have. Honest dealing isn't just morally right, it's strategically brilliant. Lesson 4. Family secrets cost more than silent saves. Edmund Morrow's deception poisoned his legacy and eventually undid his fortune. The truth he buried in 1936 surfaced 75 years later and cost his grandchildren what their grandfather had stolen. Secrets have a weight that accumulates across generations. Lesson 5. The right person at the right time can change everything. Harold couldn't have predicted Caleb Morse. He could only prepare and hope. Sometimes what we need arrives if we're paying attention and brave enough to act when it matters. Be that person for someone else. Harold Morrow sealed his truth behind a brick wall and trusted that someday, someone would find it. Caleb Morse, homeless, broke, and 18 years old, was that someone. The cottage wasn't just a shelter, it was a test, and Caleb passed it. What would you have done? Now I want to hear from you. Because this story raises a question I genuinely don't know the answer to, and I think it reveals something about who we really are. Leave your honest answer below. No judgment here. I've seen the comments on stories like this, and I promise you, the range of responses is always more interesting than the story itself, because it shows you exactly what people value when they think nobody's watching. This is the hidden vault. Every story we tell is a reminder that things are never quite what they appear. The person everyone underestimates becomes the winner. What appears worthless turns out to be priceless. Hidden truths change everything, if someone is brave enough to uncover them. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We put out one story daily, and every single one is built the same way. Researched deeply, told honestly, and designed to make you think long after it's over.